white fragility. And let me just be really clear. I mean, we're fragile in the sense of how little it takes to cause us to melt down.
Yes.
But it's not fragile at all in its impact. It's fragile like a bomb is fragile. Or fragile like broken glass, right? Because it's backed by the weight of legal authority and institutional control. And it functions, I think, as a form of everyday white racial bullying.
Right.
I'm going to make it so miserable for you to call me in that most of the time you'll just say, you know what, it's going to get more punitive, not less. I'm not going to go there. And then we stay in our places, and it protects the status quo.
It's interesting because I would describe what we have been seeing in Tennessee as white fragility, right? That, here are, the three individuals, the Tennessee three, Justin Jones, Justin Pearson, and Gloria Johnson, organizing a protest with children that just didn't want to be shot down. And the fact that they came into the well and, your decorum, instead of just censoring them or what normal process, you expel the two black men from, the representative house, and then they right back in here now. So is there? You would call that white fragility? I'm sure.
Absolutely, and maybe a bit on steroids, right? So it's the umbrage, the outrage that you would dare to basically look me in the eye as an equal and speak anything to me in any way that challenges me, right? And I am backed by the weight of the institution to then punish you for doing that, to expel you for doing that. And, we can back up and say, I don't think they were ever welcome there, but it didn't take much to legitimize a way to expel them.
Yeah, brother wore dashika on his first day, and that was enough. That was enough to put him on whatever list. So how did you come to this work? Like, was your upbringing, was it progressive? Was your household racist? So how did you get to a point where you started to say, I want to analyze how white people look at race and look at the world and how they use their position of power to oppress, other people? Yeah.
Well, first, let me just say I think all white people's households are racist because we're in a racist society. So I don't actually think I'm any less or more racist than anyone else. And that includes Donald Trump. 100%. Right? Yeah. Like, there's nothing that comes out of his mouth he's not speaking a foreign language. I recognize what he says. I was raised in the same culture. There's a difference between us in that he amplifies and embraces, and I seek to challenge and interrupt. But it's not useful for me to point my finger at him and then exempt myself. Wow. But I grew up like a classic white person, maybe a little bit different in the sense I grew up poor and working class. And I want to be really clear, classism's real. Yeah. And I felt a lot of shame as a child. There was periods of homelessness and so on. And I also always knew I was white. Yeah. Please. And I knew it was better to be white.
Yes.
And you wouldn't look at me now and know that I was raised poor. Poor whites don't have less racism than wealthy whites. We just manifested differently. Right. We're in a different position. Yeah. Right? So like most white people, I was urban poor. But what did that mean? That meant that in my early life, I was around people of color, but upward mobility would always take me away, right? I mean, white people measure the status of our environments by the least amount of black people. So if you're going to go up in life, you're going to be in whiter and whiter environments.
Wow, that's fascinating.
So kind of straightforward, typical white person in all those ways. Yeah.
Let me ask you that. So is that like implied or is that specifically stated? Like, is it specifically like are people like, man, we got to get out of here? I mean, we know white flight is real, right? And that it was like black people around here, we have to leave now. But I mean, as growing up, was that like implied to you? Like, hey, part of why you knew you weren't doing as well is because of the presence of people of color.
Definitely, right? It's both implied and explicit. I think any violent crime you see on news, somebody has to say, you'd never believe that happened here. True. Well, where was it supposed to happen, right? And I hear it every damn time, so clearly it's always happening there, right? In these so-called, safe places, right? So race is just deeply encoded in geography, and white people know it. And we communicate that to each other all the time when we warn each other. There was an app not too long ago called The Sketch Factor, where you could actually look up a neighborhood and it could tell you whether it was a sketchy neighborhood or not. And if it was, sketchy, what's that code for?
Yeah.
And so that's how we kind of police each other to maintain segregation. And I think it's explicit, although I didn't come out and say black neighborhoods, but...
I do have a fascination with the neighborhood app because it is like Miracle calls it the snitch app, but it is it is like Karen on steroids in terms of like how people are reporting the smallest little things. So I'm fascinated by that. Were you going to say something?
No, Next Door app is the snitch app.
It's the snitch app. Yes.
Literally, people looking outside their windows through their surveillance cameras and then reporting. And trying to get everybody on their side to be like, we need to do something about these interlopers.
The sketch app. So did you see like higher education as a means of you beginning to get to that next level of like, I can move away from, poverty and by whatever presence, like other black people or people of color?
It was really clear that if I was ever going to succeed in life, if you will, I was going to have to go to college. And I was a single mom. I was 30 years old. I graduated at age 34. No one in my family had ever been to college. And I was looking for a job. I'm like, okay, I got a degree in sociology. What can I do for a living? And I saw this job for a diversity trainer. And this was the early 90s. Never heard of a diversity trainer, but I read the description and thought, I'm totally qualified. I'm vegetarian. I mean, how could I be racist? So I had a classic, clueless, white, liberal kind of sense of myself.
Right.
And I applied for the job, and I got it, along with 40 other people. But it was a very racially mixed group. And for the first time in my life, people of color were calling me in. For the first time in my life, I was working side by side with people of color who were challenging me. And it was like a fish out of water.
What did you feel like you experienced like white fragility initially when people of color began to, I guess, kind of like you said, call you in?
Oh, yeah. We had to go through a 5-day train the trainer before we went out into the field. And the second half of the first day, we basically looked to the people of color and said, okay, this is the part where you teach us about racism. And they looked back and said, oh, hell no. And I remember feeling such umbrage. Like, well, if you don't teach us, how are we supposed to know? And it got very intense. And then this white woman calls out into the room, all the white racists, raise your hand. And almost all the white people raised their hand, but I didn't raise my hand. I was like, I'm not racist. And I drove home thinking I'd shown everybody that I was the good one. But of course, what I showed everybody is I didn't understand systemic racism.
Right.
And it was a brilliant move. That one question just surfaced. Okay, where are these white people at that were deemed qualified to do this work? So that was kind of part one. I mean, to be very clear, I'd raise my hand today.
Yes.
Part two was going into the workplace side by side, usually with a person of color, trying to talk to sometimes 100% white workplaces about racism. And the hostility was off the hook. And the white fragility. And the fucking meanness. I mean, we can be really mean.